privilege that I introduce you to our Pro Vice-Chancellor, Health Sciences, Professor Patricia Priest.
He ka mana e ka reo e rau rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou. Tēnei te mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o tēnei rohe, no kōtiranga me airani me ingarangi oku tipuna. Tipu ake e au ki o tautahi, e noho ana au ki o te poti ko Trish Priest tāku ingoa, ko te manakura, te wāhaka, mātua mātou haura te wharewananga o tākou ahau. I'm Trish Priest. As Sue said, I'm the Acting Pro Vice-Chancellor of Health Sciences, and it is a delight to be here to do the first speech of welcome and introduction. It's always great to learn about the work and the lives of our amazing staff at Otago, and that work, of course, spreads well beyond the Dunedin campus, which is where I'm based, although I just have to say that I did do my the clinical years of my medical degree in Christchurch, so it's very familiar being here. Becoming a professor is the apex of the academic journey, and Professor Stedman's promotion is testament to her exceptional work and dedication. I haven't met her before, but I have read her CV, and I wholeheartedly agree with others who've told me that this is a promotion that was well over time and very much deserved. She has comprehensively met the requirements for elevation to professorship. I'm really here just to generally welcome you, and particularly to welcome Catherine's parents, Peter and Adrian Malcolm, her husband Phil and children William, Luke and Isabel, and the wider family, obviously. So particularly welcome to you and anyone who's watching online.
Tēnā koutou katoa. It is my privilege to introduce Professor Catherine Stedman and provide a brief introduction to her talk. I've had the honour of introducing people for IPLs over the last 5 years for the Department of Medicine. There's been a number of people, but I must say there's nothing quite as special as being able to introduce Catherine, who's a close colleague, clinically, academically, and also a great friend. So it's really an amazing privilege to be able to be here to introduce you, and I'm very grateful for that honour. So Catherine's currently the President of the New Zealand Gastro Society, the Clinical Director of Gastroenterology at Christchurch Hospital, and the Chairperson of the South Island Hepatitis C workstream. Now, any one of those jobs will be full-time. Yeah, any one of them. She's doing all three of those things at the moment, and she's done that as well as other roles, including research, teaching, service, and raising an amazing family who are here today, and it's great to see all of you here. I've met you over the years. Catherine was awarded a University of Otago Christchurch Research Gold Medal in 2019. She achieved this accolade with probably the fewest published papers of anyone who's ever done it, because each paper was so impactful, and that's really an amazing accolade. And tonight we celebrate Catherine becoming the first female gastroenterologist to have the appointment of Professor of Medicine in New Zealand, and that's a very important accolade and something I'm very proud to be able to introduce. Catherine completed her undergraduate medical education at the University of Otago with clinical years in both Christchurch and Wellington. She commenced specialist training in gastroenterology and clinical pharmacology in Christchurch and completed this training in Westmead in Sydney. She completed a PhD in molecular pharmacology and cholestasis from the University of Sydney in the Store Liver Unit, including work undertaken at the Salk Institute in California. On her return to Christchurch Hospital as a consultant gastroenterologist, she commenced clinical research into new antiviral therapies for hepatitis C. Catherine has always been motivated by research that helps to solve the problems of medical need, and her training in both gastroenterology and clinical pharmacology means that she has the expertise in new drug development to do this. Many liver problems begin as unexplained hepatitis, and Catherine's research journey involves discovering the cause of hepatitis and the development of targets for treatment and eventual cure. Catherine has been involved at the forefront of development of new oral antiviral therapies for hepatitis C that were first demonstrated to cure hepatitis C right here in New Zealand. We should be very proud of that achievement. This research has led to major progress in treating people with advanced liver disease, and the WHO adopting global health goals for hepatitis C elimination. So that's eliminating a disease, and I think for those of you who work in medicine can understand what a huge impact that is. And as we'll hear, the therapies that have been developed by Catherine and others have saved countless lives worldwide. Autoimmune liver diseases have also had a high incidence in New Zealand, and Catherine's research has also been involved in understanding the epidemiology of these liver diseases and the impact they have on people who are affected by them. In this IPL, Catherine will discuss her research journey through these fields of medical development and the rewarding interface of combining areas outside medicine, including motherhood, with academic medical specialist career. Catherine, thank you very much.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā iwi o ngā hoewha. E oko rangatira mā, huri I te whare. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Catherine Stedman, tōku ingoa, no Otutahi Oho. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa, I rāro I ngā manaakitanga a tō tātou kaihanga. Kia ora and welcome. Thank you so much for attending tonight. I want to acknowledge the different status of people here, the different languages, tribes, ethnicities represented here, and also some of my mentors and superiors over the years, and also Creator God. So it's my great privilege to welcome you to my IPL. I'm very delighted to be here and to present to you tonight on hepatitis C and liver disease, the journey to cure and eliminate. I thought before I start on the research side, say, how did I get here? And I want to acknowledge my whānau, my parents, Peter and Adrian in particular, because I would not be here if it wasn't for them. And so if I look back in the generations, I had a grandmother on my mother's side who found herself as a single parent in the 1940s with children to bring up and no education. She left school at 12. And so she put a value on education for women that's passed on through the generations in our family. And so this is actually my mother's gown. She went to university, the first sort of the family. So, and then I grew up in a family where my father had just finished his thesis about teeth. So if any of you ever go to a dentist and he says, oh, the reason your tooth is falling apart is because it was cut into when you were younger, that's the research my father did back a little while ago. So I came from a family that put a value on education and research and science. And then in my training, I actually did no research in medical school, I'm afraid. But then when I was a registrar, I did 6 months of clinical pharmacology with Murray Barclay, who's here tonight, and also Evan Begg, and managed to sort of eventually get 2 papers out from that 6 months. I think my supervisor in Sydney said, your first paper's like birthing a baby, it takes forever. And they were like that. I did a review paper on proton pump inhibitors, which are the common drugs half of you probably take for heartburn, omeprazole, things like that, and some other proper sort of research where we did a project. I had some really valuable lessons. I learned firstly the value of an unpublished niche in the medical literature. If you can find something no one's done before, it's easy to get published. And that was the case of my proton pump inhibitor review. No one had done it before, and it was just a nice, easy journey through to publication. The other project we did really well, but it took 2 years to get it published, and that's because it was a negative study result. And so I learned the difficulties of a negative publication bias when it comes to research. And I also discovered that research is a really great flexible option with a young baby, because William was born around that time. And a good way to keep doing something, keeping your brain going, but a bit more flexibility. I then carted the family off to Sydney and embarked on some research in Sydney. So I was based at the Store Live unit at Westmead. I did actually along the way pick up a sort of an accidental job working with Johnson & Johnson, which proved actually, when you see what I did later, became very useful. So in this job, I was doing global drug safety work in the Asia Pacific team. I got a lot of experience with the FDA, with the international regulatory environment, clinical trial design and good clinical practice. And so that was actually proved very valuable later on to me, although I just did it at the time for the money. So I did that a little bit on the side to help pay some bills. I had 2 wonderful mentors in Sydney, Chris Little and Jacob George, both professors of medicine, wonderful men, great mentors to me. And so they got me started on this pathway of liver research. So the basic premise here, if we start looking at liver research, just for those of you who are not in the field, is, majority of people are born with a nice healthy liver. It looks like this is lamb's fry at the butcher's shop. But things happen to your liver along the way. So if we look at these things, drugs might affect it, viruses might affect it, alcohol might affect it, being overweight might affect it, or immune injury or other things might damage the liver. And then it gets this process of scar tissue development, becomes fibrosis, and then becomes cirrhotic or cirrhosis of the liver. And that's a state of severe scarring of the liver. And one of the things that leads to is liver failure and death or liver cancer. And so a lot of research in the field of liver disease is around looking at what can we do to stop that process of progression. So what can we do about the causes? How can we slow progression? Or what can we do about the protective mechanisms in the liver that help protect it? I'm going to get the sort of basic science bit out of the way at the beginning of the talk. So in Sydney, I was plunged into a career as a transition, really, as to a mouse surgeon and a laboratory scientist. Quite a shock when you come straight out of clinical medicine, I have to say. You have to go back to being shown how to do all the basics. So cholestatic liver disease is a special type of liver disease where bile flow is affected. So if we look, the bile flows down the bile ducts out of the liver. If something blocks this process, it might be a tumour, it might be a gallstone, or it might be an immune process or a drug reaction that damages the lining of the bile ducts. The bile can't flow and the bile gets backed up, and bile acids are like detergents and then they damage the liver. So that's a cluster of liver disease. And so one animal model is to operate on mice and do an operation and tie off the bile duct. So it's a good way of mimicking human disease. And so in Sydney, I ended up doing quite a lot of work using this model with mice, special mice that had humanized transgenes or nuclear receptors genes knocked out. So I'm just going to do a little bit on this, won't go on for too long, then I'll get on to Hep C. But these cholestatic liver disease, we did a lot of work looking at things called nuclear receptors, and these are things like FXR, PXR, CAR. These are basically things that drugs and bile acids bind to. If you look at the picture, the drugs and bile acids bind to the nuclear receptors, and then they bind to genes, and they switch genes on and off. So this is how we control the genes in our body. So my first Sydney project was looking at a special gene in the liver called CYP3A. This is actually a human gene that was put into the mice, so I didn't do that. That had been done before I got there. And it's a really important gene because it controls this enzyme called CYP3A4 that actually breaks down about 60% of all drugs we use or take, and it breaks down natural substances like bile acids and other things as well. So one of the things we wanted to look at is whether this gene is switched on as a protective mechanism in people with this bile acid overload. And so we did the bile duct ligations, and if you look at the pictures here, you'll see that after 3, 6, and 10 days afterwards, this gene was really strongly switched on in these mice. So this showed that this is upregulated in response to cholestasis. At the same time, we did a bit of work actually looking at a human study because there are some herbal drugs are often actually pharmacologically active. And so one herbal drug we looked at was St. John's wort. This is used usually for depression, but there are drug interactions reported via this particular enzyme, CYP3A, and one of the constituents does bind to one of those nuclear receptors, PXR. And so we did a clinical trial of patients who had cholestatic liver disease and gave them this herbal drug to see what it did. And it did improve symptoms in some of these patients, but we also got some quite varied outcomes, and I got another learning about research process because we actually had quite a heterogeneous group of patients with different causes for their cholestasis, and that actually upset some of the results because, so I learned quite a lot about the importance of really tight inclusion criteria if you're answering a really specific question. At the same time, I did a big review paper on herbal drugs and their toxic effects on the liver. And that gave me the privilege of being like a world expert on that topic for a few years, which was interesting. But I've found that it's been very valuable evidence of knowledge ever since. During this time, I also got the opportunity to go to the Salk Institute in San Diego and work with Ron Evans' laboratory there. And he's probably one of the top scientists in the world, runs a huge, big gene expression laboratory in San Diego at the Salk Institute. It was an amazing opportunity. I felt really insecure going. Here I am, this little doctor from New Zealand, what do I know? But what I learned is about the value of partnership, because I brought the clinical application. I could see where things might go, where they might be clinically relevant. They didn't get that because they're not doctors and they didn't have my gastroenterology training. I also could actually have the surgical technique to make the experiments work, which they couldn't make work either. So it was a good partnership. They had all these mice that had all these genes knocked out. CAR, PXR, FXR. So the genes had all had these genes knocked out of these mice. And we did surgery on them, and then we looked at what happened. And I guess what we did initially was we confirmed our initial hypothesis that, in fact, if you knocked out that PXR gene, so that you couldn't switch on that other enzyme, that CYP3A, then the mice had much worse liver damage to their livers compared with the other mice. And so it showed that these protective responses are really important in cholestatic liver disease. I went back a second time to the Salk, and I do apologise to Phil and Luke. Luke was 10 months old, he was fully breastfed, and he got influenza the day I left. So that was not ideal at the family level, but Phil magnificently survived, and so did Luke, which was great. So that was a sort of 9-day trip, I think, from memory. And we did more of the same. We looked at mice with different things knocked out, and some interesting observations that, whereas the liver damage was worse if you knocked out PXR, in fact, if you knocked out FXR, they got less liver damage, and the two things seemed to cancel each other out. And then we did a whole lot of work. They had these big molecular things, which I won't bore you with, looking at lots and lots of genes and transporters and things to do with cholesterol and how all these nuclear receptors control those. And we got a lot of very useful data from this work. So that's the end of the real basic science part of the talk. We then came back to New Zealand, and at that point, William laughed at me when I said I was a doctor. He said, "Mum, you can't be a doctor, you only operate on mice." So that was what my son thought at that point. So we came back to New Zealand, and I have continued some work in autoimmune liver disease, as Richard very kindly alluded to. So autoimmune liver diseases are diseases where the body attacks itself, basically. So there's pure autoimmune hepatitis, where the body attacks the sort of main liver, and then there are some autoimmune diseases that cause cholestasis, so it links to what I was doing in Sydney. So basically the immune system damages the bile ducts, so these cause cholestatic liver disease. And the autoimmune hepatitis started out life called just chronic active hepatitis. They had no idea what it was. Then they eventually worked out it was the immune system attacking it, and then we're going on from there. So two people have done a lot of this work with me, Jeffrey New, who unfortunately is in Chicago at the moment, so away, and Mahol Lemba, who's in Canada, so neither of them is here. One of the things we noticed, and the older timers like Bruce would say, oh, we seem to have a lot of autoimmune hepatitis around here. So we did a prevalence study, and we showed that, in fact, New Zealand has one of the highest prevalences of autoimmune hepatitis in the world. Well, Canterbury does. My Auckland colleagues tell me it's not as high up there, but so we have a high prevalence of autoimmune hepatitis. It was thought to be a disease of younger women, and our data showed that, in fact, it's more a disease of, we called it older women in this, but now I'm this age group, I'm like, no, it's like, it's middle-aged women. So we also showed, though, in contrast, that those other ones, those cholestatic autoimmune diseases, actually we just got a sort of standard prevalence of. So clearly the drivers for them are different. They can't just all be one thing out of the environment. Now, autoimmune diseases are complex. They're to do with environmental triggers, failure of immune tolerance, genetic predispositions, and then you get this T-cell immune-mediated attack on some part of the body, simplistically. So genes, environment, ethnicity, and other diseases are important. And so Jeffrey did a lot of work looking at both genetics, the role of environmental factors. So, for example, antibiotics in childhood increase your risk of these types of things. Having a wood fire in your home reduces the risk of these things. So things like that. And we looked at some differences between East and West as well in terms of ethnic backgrounds. We also looked at outcomes, and people had tended to think that autoimmune hepatitis was reasonably benign because you can just throw some steroids at it, you can treat it, it'll all be okay. And in fact, we tracked these people over 5-10 years and showed that, in fact, the survival does drop off, even with treated autoimmune hepatitis. It's about a 2-fold increase in mortality. If you look at the other diseases, PBC's down lower, and PSC is even worse because there is no treatment for PSC at the moment. So we showed that actually the mortality is probably worse than people had thought. And we also did some work looking at the relationship with other diseases such as inflammatory bowel disease, and does this make PSC worse or better in terms of outcomes. So Jeffrey did a lot of this work as his PhD with Richard and myself. We've also looked at some changes over time, and what Mahol Lemba did is we looked at some of these people 10 years later, and we showed that actually the incidence of autoimmune hepatitis in Canterbury is increasing over time. Whereas interestingly, the other two have stayed flat. The PSC and PBC have stayed reasonably flat. And Mahol also has done some work looking at some subtypes of autoimmune hepatitis, but I won't go into too much detail on that front. So what I want to say here is the autoimmune journey for liver disease is halfway there. We know it's autoimmune, we've got some understanding of the epidemiology and who gets these things, but it's an ongoing journey to really understand what's driving this disease. And at the moment, we have no cure. We have treatments for autoimmune hepatitis, which is just general immunosuppression, which improves outcomes. And there are some emerging drug trials in the other diseases, looking at some of those nuclear receptors I mentioned at the beginning, but it's only halfway there. The other big thing, though, that I found when I came back to Christchurch was that there's a big Hep C population in Christchurch, or there was. Hepatitis C started off as a non-A, non-B hepatitis in 1963, seen in the Royal Marines. In 1989, they found a virus and called it hepatitis C. And at the point I came back to Christchurch, our main treatment was this drug called interferon, various forms of it, but basically it stimulates the immune system. It's given by injection. It was a fairly limited drug. We poisoned, the nurses and I poisoned a lot of people with it, but basically had low response rates, less than 10% cure rates in some strains of Hep C, even lower success rates the worse your liver disease got, and very toxic. You know, I'm not joking, we had people end up in psychiatric hospitals, we had people making, very suicidal, we had all sorts of terrible side effects from this drug. But it was the only thing we had, so we gave it a go because otherwise people died of Hep C. At the same time, there was a bit of research, this is not my research, but looking at these emerging new antiviral drugs, a protease inhibitor, and they tried giving it to some people in a few trials. And what happened is the viral load came down for about 5 days, and then the virus mutated, became resistant, and the viral load went up again. So everyone was like, well, that's not working too well. So the obvious next step, there was a huge unmet medical need in terms of Hep C at that point. When I came back, there was a 2-year waiting list to be seen for Hep C in Christchurch, so I just thought, well, I'll just start seeing all the Hep C patients and offer them what I can out of what we've got at the moment. So the next step, of course, was to try and add all these toxic drugs together. So they gave the peg interferon and the ribavirin and the protease inhibitors. Linda Erickson and Judith McLaughlin were absolute soldiers trying to sort of treat these patients, and Tracy Noonan as well got involved with the trials. So by putting these drugs together, we did get some improved response rates in terms of outcomes. So it was sort of worth a go. If you've got no other options, it was worth a go. But the toxicity was even worse. There was a very real risk of liver decompensation and death in people with cirrhosis and advanced liver disease. But we did about 12 trials over this period, and I have to acknowledge it was a huge workload for the nurses and for me as well, but big workload. They were hard work, these trials. They were 6, 12, 18 months long, really hard work. So the problem is, though, in this era, it was pretty grim. Many people died from liver failure from Hep C. Outcomes if you transplanted people were really bad because the virus would reinfect the liver straight away. Because of the immunosuppression, they'd get fast liver disease progression, and they did badly. And even as recently as 2018, the mortality from hepatitis C was 100-fold higher than from HIV. So it was a bad disease. So Ed Gain contacted me. He's a colleague of mine from Auckland. I know him very well. And he said, look, you've got this great phase 1 unit in Christchurch. Richard Robson, who I think is here somewhere, and Chris Wynne, you've got this wonderful unit. Why don't you start working with them? And they've now set up a unit in Auckland, and we can work together, and we can take on Hep C and take on some new trials. I was like, yep, sure, we've got enough need. We need new options. And the exciting thing, I think, about this is that rather than just working at the sort of phase 3 level where the company tells you what to do and you just enroll patients, it was more an opportunity to actually get involved in the design of trials and get involved in what are we going to do and what's the path forward. So we formed a partnership, and that's been phenomenal. So the premise here was to look at oral drugs to inhibit the Hep C virus. So the Hep C virus replicates in the liver, and so there's various different phases. I won't go into too much detail, but there are protease inhibitors, polymerase inhibitors, and S5A inhibitors. So these are all places you could potentially target and stop the virus from replicating. So the first study we did was called the INFORM-1 study. And this was the first in the world, first time anyone done it in the world, was we took a leaf out of the HIV book. HIV has been successfully managed by combining multiple antivirals, but no one had actually done it in Hep C. So this first study was combining 2 of these oral antivirals. We locked these patients up for 14 days at CCST. One of the patients said, it's fine, it's like being in jail, but it's much nicer. So I was like, good, yep. So we locked the patients up, and then once the viral loads came down, we treated them with the usual interferon afterwards. So what you see here is the viral loads came down, and we actually got no resistance. So that was really exciting, sort of proof of concept that this might be the way forward in Hep C. The next study, a company then, that sort of put us on the map. We had done that with an Australian group as well. A little company called Pharmaset then contacted us from the US, and they said, look, we've got this compound we've developed, up in the right-hand the structure here. It's called PSI 7977. They all had numbers at that stage. We think it's got potential in Hep C. It's a good polymerase inhibitor. It's safe, looks safe in a few phase 1 studies we've done. It can be dosed once a day. It looks like it's not going to have such bad resistance problems, and it works in the laboratory against all the Hep C strains. So they said, would you be interested in exploring interferon-free treatment for Hep C? And we said, yes, that sounds great. So we got 40 patients onto this study. And the challenge was the Christchurch earthquake occurred once we had all the patients on the study. And I had this delightful phone call from Ed Gain, who rang me the night of the earthquake to say, Catherine, are you okay? Is your family alive? Is everyone okay? And what are we going to do about this study? So it was this amazing effort, and I have to acknowledge Richard and Chris Taylor, who did amazing efforts to keep this study afloat. So I think they smuggled people into CCST, and they had generators, and we did things, and the patients were incredible. Like, the patients didn't want interferon, so they were really motivated about this study. And most of the patients lived in East Christchurch. We had a patient walked in from the study with no shoes on because their shoes got lost in the earthquake, but they walked in for their study visit. So huge thanks to the people who took part. So we reported these results in San Francisco. So it was a design, the first 4 lines. Basically, the normal treatment for interferon was 6 or 12 months. These people got 12 weeks of sofosbuvir, or 7977 as it was then, and ribavirin, and then they got either 12 weeks, 8 weeks, 4 weeks, or no interferon, and that had never been done before. So that's what we did. And if you look at the results, you'll see here that actually everybody in that first cohort, it was only 40 patients, everybody got cured. So that was a moment. I was at San Francisco, this data was presented, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people in multiple rooms, and the place was just like a pin drop. It was this absolute gasp at these results. I walked back with one of the lead people in Gilead, and he said to me, that's just blown our entire trial development program out of the window globally. So it was that kind of thing. 3 weeks, so this was proof of concept for the first time ever that you could cure Hep C without interferon. It's small numbers. We were probably lucky we got such good results, actually. So 3 weeks later, Gilead announced they were buying Pharmaset for $11 billion on the basis of that trial data. We did not get any of the money, I'm sorry. Ed and I got a very nice paper in the New England Journal, which has got almost 1,000 citations. So that was a real landmark for Hep C. Now we carried on. So Gilead very rapidly rolled out a phase 3 program here on the right of the slide, lots of trials. And you'll see if you look at these, so this was just in genotype 2 and 3 Hep C, so just 2 strains of Hep C. You'll see here that when you do the big volume studies, the numbers are never as good as you get, and we were quite lucky we got such good results in the first one. So you'll see it depends on what type of Hep C you've got and how much cirrhosis you've got, whether you've got cirrhosis or not. So in fact, if you had cirrhosis in type 3 Hep C, you only had about a 30% cure rate on the big study, whereas if you had no cirrhosis in genotype 2, it was close to 100. So obviously there's more work to be done. So we did those big phase 3 studies at the hospital here. Tracy Noonan ran those, and all the hepatology nurses frantically recruited for them. At the same time at CCST, we kept going with the phase 2 work because there was a lot more sort of testing hypothesis to be done. So we looked at different strains of Hep C, we looked at different degrees of liver fibrosis, looked at whether people had had treatment before or not, different doses, different treatment durations. And we found that optimal duration was sort of 12 weeks probably for this regimen. Prior failure with interferon was a negative predictive factor, and that the other strains didn't do so well with just this combination. So you'll see here, it suppressed it well, but then they relapsed, the genotype 1 and 4. So the next hypothesis, coming back to the earlier study, was obviously we add a second drug. So Gilead were fortunately, had another drug to pair up with it. That's why they were so keen. And this was a drug that's now become ladipizvir. And you'll see here, if you look at this data, that people who had failed previous interferon treatment went from a 10% response rate to 100% on small numbers again. We were doing all this sort of testing work. That rolled into a big phase 3 program, which we also took part in here at the hospital. The ION studies, and you'll see here that for genotype 1 and 4 hepatitis C, this basically conclusively demonstrated that one pill once a day, it was a combo tablet, for 12 weeks, had a 97% cure rate for Hep C. So that was big for the world. We carried on, again doing this sort of hypotheses, so looked at more things on different genotypes, different durations, looking at this combination treatment now rather than just the sofosbuvir, what's now called sofosbuvir, looking at sofosbuvir with ladipizvir. We showed that 4 weeks was not enough. Your Hep C doesn't go away, it comes back quickly. Again, we showed that people who had failed previous interferon didn't do quite so well. And we started doing more specialised groups. So we did some trials looking at people with co-infected with hepatitis B, co-infected with HIV, people with renal failure, people with and without cirrhosis, etc. And so a good number of good publications from that. But I think the big motivation for us as clinicians was to cure the patients. We treated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients in these trials. And you have to remember, at this time, the only drug available was that horrible toxic interferon. That was the only thing available anywhere in the world. Did a couple of really nice niche cohorts. We looked at people with haemophilia and bleeding disorders, because this group of people have been really badly hit by blood product contamination. They'd got either HIV or Hep C, and they're usually excluded from all drug trials. So we did a nice little pilot group of them and cured them all, which was lovely. And then we also branched out into people whose livers were failing. And this was a bit of a first in the world as well. Because traditionally, if you gave someone who borderline liver function interferon, you'd basically speedily tip them into liver failure. So everyone was fairly shy of that. So these drugs seemed very safe. So we did a small cohort of 20 patients, you'll see up here, and gave them ladipizvir, sofosbuvir for 12 weeks. And we cured about 2/3 of them. So that was really pivotal because that led to some big global studies looking at using this drug in liver failure. The important thing about it is it opens up the question, can we pull these people back from dying? Can we pull them back from needing transplantation? And we can pull some of them back, but not everybody, is the answer. I won't go into all the data. It also then opened up a compassionate access program from Gilead, which was really important for our patients because, as I said, the ethical feeling of knowing that there's a drug that I'm giving to other patients who can get in a drug trial that can cure Hep C, while I have people in their 40s dying in front of me from Hep C, is a horrible feeling, I have to tell you. And so Gilead opened up a compassionate program, which I oversaw for the South Island. And it's lovely, I think someone here in the audience who was part of that. And to get on that, you probably had to have a median life expectancy of less than 2 years. And some of those people are still alive now. I had a lovely email from someone else from Dunedin when my promotion was announced. So we had a wee pause somewhere there. I can't quite work out where I fitted it in, but somewhere in 2012, we went to London for a sabbatical. This is the family. I didn't get permission for this. But anyway, it was great. We went to I spent some time at King's College London, which I write one of the best liver units in the whole world. And what staggered me was how much far ahead of them we were in Hep C. They were giving people blood transfusions every 2 weeks to try and get them through this horrible triple therapy with interferon thing. And I was like, oh, I wouldn't even be offering that to my patients. I'd be telling them to wait because these new drugs are so good. So it was really nice to be, for once, New Zealand way ahead of, King's College London. It was a great time too for the family, great family holiday for them, and also for William. He conceived the dream of becoming a Paralympian while we were in London. And 2 Paralympic Games later, So that's been a huge benefit from that sabbatical coming forward. So we carried on and looked at other strains of Hep C. So the genotype 3, you'll remember, well you may not remember, but the cure rates dropped off when you got cirrhosis and genotype 3 of Hep C. So Gilead had another drug on the pipeline, or they bought it from somebody else, called valpatisvir. Well, it was 5816 at that time for a long time, but it's now valpatisvir. And this looked good against the other strains of Hep C, and we did some trials on that. Showed it was actually highly effective against genotype 2 and 3 Hep C. We then sort of broadened out and started looking at this in people who had failed previous treatment. See, one of the big issues with viruses is if you give them a treatment that's not successful, the virus mutates and then becomes resistant to that class of drugs. So the danger is that you'll breed a multi-resistant virus that becomes untreatable, and that's what you do not want to do. So what we showed with the valpatisvir was, and at this point we're starting to nitpick, because they were getting to 100% cure rates across quite a lot of strains. But if you were, genotype 3 and you'd failed previous treatment and you had baseline, what they sort of euphemistically call resistance-associated variations or resistance substitutions, which is basically variants or mutated virus, then your cure rate drops off. And this is the group of people who are at risk of multi-drug resistant virus. So there was a quest to look for another option for these people, to rescue people. So coming back to the initial slide and the initial concept, maybe if we added in a third antiviral drug, this might work. So we already had sofosbuvir, well established by this point, ladipizvir for genotype 1 and 4, valpatisvir for genotype 2 or 3. And Gilead had now acquired another drug called voxilatravir, which was a new protease inhibitor, much better than the original ones. So a couple of things to explore here. Firstly, how short can you go with treatment? Can you drop it down from 8 to 12 weeks down to 4 weeks? That would be nice and convenient for everybody. And then secondly, how do we rescue people with treatment failure who are hard to treat? So I'm not going to go through all the details of this, but we did a whole lot of arms of study, again through CCST, with this triple combination, looking at different durations, 4, 6, 8 weeks, different groups of patients, treatment experience, naive, cirrhosis or not. Bottom line, we found that 4 weeks didn't really work, too short. And we also found that this triple combination was the answer for the hardest to treat group of patients. We cured them all in this study. Again, that was the phase 2 work, a big phase 3 work then went on as well, which we took part in. In the meantime, the big global market expansion was happening, and so Gilead, of course, needed to recoup their $11 billion. So they brought sofosbuvir to market in 2013 as Sovaldi for $1,000 US per tablet. They said it was a price for a cure, which is true. It was 84,000 US for a course of treatment. So that put it beyond the price of most of our patients. Pharmac, surprise, did not leap to fund that. Sofosbuvir ladipizvir came to market in 2014, now called Harvoni. That is now actually funded in New Zealand for people with liver failure. Sofval, or sofosbuvir valpatisvir, came to market through the phase 3 studies. We did part of those as well, Astral studies. Marketed in 2016 as Epclusa for genotypes 2 and 3. And then the triple therapy, Sofval Vox, came to market in 2017 as Vosevi. Pharmac have still never funded that. But, they might have on a nipper or two for people. And that's been basically registered for treatment failures. So this created this whole sort of ethical situation where you've got this highly priced drug that can cure people, but it's beyond the reach of a lot of people in the world. The compassionate access and access to drug trials became increasingly important for our patients because the only other option was interferon. And then the new thing that got sort of spawned was the rise of the buyers clubs and use of generic drugs made in the Indian factories. And as an Australian buyers club tested some of this, it looked like it was actually sound pharmacologically. It was actually the same factory. I think they just ran it overnight, as you do. And so we started, and all the hepatology nurses, Judith and Jess particular probably, and not sure Linda had left by that point, were involved in actually supporting patients to import drug for their own use. because you could do it for a fraction of the price. And Ed Gain and I decided ethically that we thought we should support patients to do this because we thought it was the right thing to save their livers. So we treated a lot of people that way as well. Just to put a note of realism, we did lots of trials that didn't work as well. Not everything we touched, not everything turned to gold. There's lots of drugs we trialled, things that didn't really work at all. Or even one like this one. This was a Gilead one we did a few studies in. Good studies, published actually, worked, but by that point, anything less than 95% wasn't good enough, and they just made the sort of marketing decision to cull that drug because it wasn't quite as good. So interesting. And of course, some of the less successful things don't even get published. We did get involved in some other companies because then there was this big global race coming on because it's a big pot of money available for Hep C. And so we did some work with AbbVie looking at glecaprevir, pabrentasvir. We were less involved in the sort of design of these studies, so they were good to do for getting patients treated. We were involved in both phase 2 and phase 3 studies of these. This was another combo drug and came through a bit later and shown to be highly effective, again with a sort of 98% cure rate. So we took part in those. And then that drug came to market in 2017. So that one's 3 tablets once a day, 8 weeks, 98% cure rate. Can't use it in people with liver failure though, it's not safe in that situation. So did some studies in that as well, but not quite as integrally sort of involved in the early phase work for that one. So just moving on very quickly now to what does this mean in New Zealand? So at the same time we started going, well, what are we going to do about New Zealand and how many people have got Hep C? So we formed a sort of epidemiology group. We worked out, well, we estimated about 50,000 people had Hep C at the time. It was probably a bit of an overestimate. We started looking at modelling with a person called Jaime Rezavi from the CDC in America. And basically what we were already seeing, and my colleagues will all attest to this, we've seen rapid increases in liver cancer rates relating to Hep C for the last decade. And that's predicted to just keep on increasing. Liver-related deaths, liver-related decompensation on this line. And that's what we would expect to keep seeing if we'd carried on with interferon. And the modelling suggested if we could get these drugs funded, then we would reduce all those things dramatically by 2030. So about 80% reduction in those nasty outcomes. So I had the joy of going to Pharmac and met with them and presented all this data and went over the modelling to lobby Pharmac very nicely and ask if they would look at funding a cure. It's a high upfront cost, but if you can prevent years and years or decades of healthcare costs, it's well worthwhile. As Richard alluded to, the World Health Organization in 2016 basically announced that hepatitis C elimination should be a global goal by 2030. It's not going to get there by 2030, but it's a nice goal to have, and it's amazing that we're even talking about it. It's amazing that we're thinking of getting rid of Hep C. We did quite a lot of work. This is more lobbying kind of work with the Ministry of Health, looking at pillars of how to get Hep C eliminated from New Zealand, what's it going to take. One of the key things here is we need to work with our colleagues in harm reduction services, needle exchanges, because we need to stop transmission and treat the Hep C. So we've got to embrace all those things and work together as colleagues and really make that effective. So a whole lot of work looking at those sorts of things and partnerships and how can we work together to achieve elimination for everybody. Because unless we get everyone treated, we're not going to eliminate. Ed and I got quite actively involved in writing guidelines for New Zealand and for GPs and for specialists for Hep C to help people, equip them once we got these new drugs, got some of them funded. And we also started doing some trials with the Australians. Greg Dawes' group from the Kirby Institute started doing a lot of work looking at treating Hep C in people who are actively injecting drugs. And this is really important because we're never going to achieve elimination of Hep C unless we treat the people who are actively injecting drugs now, because that's where the transmission is mostly happening at the moment. And what we showed in these studies is that treating Hep C in this group is highly effective. You basically get almost as good a results as you do in everybody else, and we should be targeting these people to get them treated. We did a lot of local efforts towards Hep C elimination. Jenny Burke's here in the audience, and Marilyn, I can see you both up there. So the Hep C Community Clinic was groundbreaking. Jenny formed it over 10 years ago. got it off the ground, huge effort. And this provides free testing and treatment for people for Hep C. It's co-located with the needle exchange, just Washington Way. And they've done an amazing job, and we've very much partnered with them over the years to come alongside, treat people together, try and get people into trials. Jenny would come and help with, because my patients did not have very good veins, I have to say. So getting blood out of them was quite a challenge for trials. So a lot of work there. The South Island Alliance has been great, the South Island Workstream. I've been delighted to just now hand over the chairmanship of that to Philippa. We've had this mobile bus get started more recently, which is very much a partnership because it provides Hep C. The aim is to provide Hep C testing and treatment and harm reduction, so needle exchange and things in one package. And we've done a bit of work with the Gut Foundation as well, doing some testing of construction workers. Jimmy Tiong's been working with me. We've offered 26,000 people in general primary practice free Hep C tests. Only a fraction of them took it up, but we're doing things like that as well. There's also just been a global effort towards Hep C elimination. So we've joined a Polaris collaborator group, which is a global group looking at Hep C elimination. So we did some work to find out how many people in the world do we think have got Hep C. How many people a year are being treated? How is the world tracking towards elimination? So there's been quite a lot of work in that. The key thing, though, that I would like to leave you here with is the top thing. In the last 10 years, now 13 million people have had Hep C treated with direct-acting antivirals. That's huge because the impact of that on those people, on their whānau, on their health system costs is enormous. And eventually we'll get to elimination. So for hepatitis C, it started off as this non-A, non-B virus. In 1989, they worked out what was causing it. It was Hep C, and they gave it a virus title. We've done this big, long journey through horrible drugs, trying to understand the virus. How can we target it? What can we do about it? And now we have a goal of eliminating this virus from the world. That's only taken 30 years, which is actually pretty good. Autoimmune hepatitis, I mentioned before, it's still only halfway along. That's the value of research, though. So just for finally, what I'd like to say is I think that targeting unmet medical need is the best motivation for medical research. It's really motivational, it keeps you going when it's tough, because it's not always easy. I think partnerships are really, really powerful. All my work's been done in partnership. It's partnership with my nursing colleagues, it's partnership with trial staff, it's partnership with colleagues, it's partnership with patients, it's partnerships internationally. And that's where our strength has been. I think that cure and elimination are really satisfying endpoints to research. So finally, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you to Peter and Adi for your support over decades, 5 decades. Thank you to, I want to really acknowledge all the patients because it was a huge commitment for people to take part in these studies, to have all their bloods and do all the turning up, and that's how we've got there. It's been a real partnership with them and all my colleagues and collaborators. You've all been wonderful to work with, so thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. For those who don't know me, my name's David Murdoch. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today to hear Catherine's talk and also to be back here in Christchurch. That was a wonderful talk, Catherine, and just thank you for sharing your journey. I guess the overwhelming impression that I take away from it, firstly, just what an amazing amount of work that you've done, not only in terms of quantum, but impact. And you talk to that. Gosh, the talk about cures, I mean, just incredible. So the impact of your work is really phenomenal. You're on a fractional academic appointment. I'm not sure I've mentioned that. Catherine's not a full-time academic. This has been done on a small proportion of her time. And I just think that's a real testament to you. Just makes it even more amazing. It's integrated into the health system. This is research, this is impactful research globally that's come, a lot of it from, well, the New Zealand health system. And I think it's a good reminder of the strength of places like here in Christchurch, where the clinical research is so good, the opportunities to do clinical research, that is absolutely world standing. So really, Catherine, you've shown that. And I guess the other impression, your humility. I absolutely agree with Trish. This promotion was well overdue. I think you're very understated, but what you've done is just incredible. And you brought back a few memories. You know, when I was an infectious disease trainee during the interferon era, I remember that very well. It was pretty depressing, really. Also, Trish and I ran a clinical trial here during the Canterbury earthquake, so I think we can, a lot of memories of breaking into the red zone to try and get our drugs, and negotiating with Singaporean military to get into for that. Anyway, it was a really challenging time, and it was amazing, and particularly the participants. I remember just how, you know, how we managed to keep that going. It was a lot of hard work, so I can appreciate that. I have so big thank you, big thank you for sharing your journey with us. And I have two other tasks, which is really to thank you all for coming along today. And also just to invite you all to join us in the foyer to share some light refreshments. And I think the protocol is that I will lead the way out, but I think we just need one more applause, acknowledge Catherine for a wonderful talk.